Masco is proud to support DPTV and its 50-year celebration of American Black Journal. At Masco, every day we aim to get better at giving a voice to everyone in our community. We congratulate American Black Journal for providing engaging and vital discussions to help our community thrive.
Support also provided by
Welcome to the most important city in America. And is it okay if I say that tonight we honor the most important program in the history of Detroit Public Television? And even better, you all came. Thank you so much. My biggest concern when you throw a party at your house, at the last minute, you want, is everybody coming? Are they going to come spend the evening with us? Are they going to have fun? Do we have the right folks in the room? So many of you got a note from me and us saying, join us for the evening, and who needs to be in the audience? And so many of you gave us lists and told us about people who had been touched by the show and people who needed to be renewing their relationship with the station. And our goal here, Kirk Mays said, we built a committee to talk about this evening. And Kirk Mays said to me, make it feel like a reunion. And I said, I can say that if I can tell people that you told me to make it feel like a reunion. And so Kirk Mays said we should make this feel like a reunion, and I hope that's what you're feeling right now. Many of you have a personal connection to this show. It is extraordinary. Stephen's going to talk about the history, and that's really his assignment tonight. You'll hear a really wonderful telling of the story and some great guests, and it just should be a wonderful evening. But I just want you to know a little bit about where the station is today and where we're going. So 10 years ago, we said to our board, shows are important, but we need to start thinking about issues. And we need to start thinking about stakeholders. And we need to start thinking about engagement and getting face-to-face with people. And then about 5 years ago, our team started to do a series of road shows where we go out in the community and we spend time understanding a problem, and then we make television, and then we stay with the problem, and then we stay with the community. So many of you in this room have been involved with those. Maybe you were at the boxing gym, or we're in Southwest Detroit. Maybe you've been with us in Brightmoor. Maybe you were with us in Island View recently. Just wonderful opportunities to understand our town and to understand where you need your public television station, and that's where we expect to be. So if we don't know your story, call us, tell us, make us understand, pound on the table if you need to, but that's our goal, and that's our expectation. That is how we will flourish at Detroit Public Television. So tonight is an important benchmark, and we started about a year ago to think about tonight. WGPR helped us. We did one of our first sort of launch events here. Who's the GPR folks are here. And then since then, a whole host of events that has pulled this community closer to you. And then tonight, we celebrate just one of the legendary shows in public television, one of the oldest shows in broadcast history, public television history. Yep. And it's come a long way. And I think today the energy for the show is as good as it's ever been. And most important, we ask you to tell us where to take the show and how to bring this together and where we're going forward. So I think you told us what kind of evening you wanted. I think we're going to do that pretty well. And tell us where we need to go next. That's important. So just a couple of thank yous for it. I want to thank all the team that helped put this together. I like to say we're the best play-by-play team in public broadcasting. Our crews, our technicians, our talent, we're getting really good at this, bring people together and understand it. I want to thank our technicians. I want to thank our staff. I want to personally thank Stephen Henderson, who's just given new life to the show. Amazing. Yep. It's tough to work with a Pulitzer Prize winner. And well, you know the story on talent. There's only two kinds of talent. The people who are just what you would want them to be, and then the others. Stephen's just what you would want him to be. Nicest man. So a word from our sponsors. The Masco Corporation is our major sponsor tonight. We've had help along the way from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, DTE, the Ford Motor Fund, and all the other sponsors you see here. Before we get started, I want to introduce you to Michelle Green, new Vice President for IT at Masco, an organization that's been good for this town for a long time. Today, Michelle became a member of our board. She's the leading face from Masco inside of our organization. And I want to welcome her as an important new Detroiter and an important new voice. Michelle?
So good evening. Good evening. Masco is proud to support Detroit Public Television and be the presenting. Mike? Got it. Okay. So we'll try this again. Good evening. Again, I am Michelle Green, and as Rich mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Information Technology at Masco Corporation, and we are super excited to be the presenting sponsor for tonight's event. When we heard about this event, we knew how important it was for us to play a key part because this is a major milestone. We're addressing issues, making sure we figure out ways to help the Detroit community thrive, and making sure that we can be a partner within this community. So on behalf of the 26,000 Masco employees, thank you so much for having us. We're excited about the celebration, and please enjoy the evening.
We delivered the show you help us build. To get us started, Yancey and John Lawrence are going to take us out. Have a great evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the host of American Black Journal, Stephen Henderson.
Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to our 50th anniversary celebration of American Black Journal. So the year was 1968, and a show unlike any other on local television debuted on Detroit Public Television. It was called CPT, or Colored People's Time. Can you imagine that? It's a reminder that language and culture are always in flux, always changing around us, right? And this show provided a voice for African Americans after the 1967 civil disturbance right here in Detroit. Today, that program is known as American Black Journal, and I am its host. I don't know how many people know this, but it is the longest running public affairs show on any local television station. So tonight we're here at the Garden Theater in Midtown to celebrate our 50th anniversary. I'd like to thank saxophonist Yancey and guitarist John Lawrence for getting everything started. And over the next 90 minutes, we'll have musical performances, we'll have a little storytelling, and of course, thought-provoking conversation, which is really our strong suit on American Black Journal. Plus, we'll take you on a trip down memory lane with a look back at past episodes, and maybe you'll see some past glimpses of me over the years, right? How have I changed over the 10 years of American Black Journal? The show's name changed from CPT to Detroit Black Journal to American Black Journal, and there have been several hosts. But it all began with African-American trailblazer Tony Brown.
Moses looking again, Moses looking again. Good evening, and welcome to CPT, television's newest experiment in the newest color, black. This week we're going to have Brother George Kirby, Brother Earl Grant, and we're going to examine the voting patterns of the brother in next Tuesday's election.
A lot of people today don't have the kind of philosophy that you do. A lot of young people, I know you do a lot for young people. They don't know what it is to struggle, it seems. A lot of people get things very easy. When you talk to a group of young people, what do you say to them?
That's one of the things I clarified right away. I let them know that they don't know.
Jesse Jackson.
Yes.
Nation's not ready for a black president. You yourself are saying that that's one of the reasons that you couldn't support him wholeheartedly.
I just didn't believe he could win.
But you also have stated, or at least it's been said you've stated, that the nation isn't ready to elect a black president.
That's why I don't believe he can win.
When you criticize the media and its role in the campaign, what do you feel can be done about that?
Well, I think, first of all, the people are going to have to wake up and take more of an active interest in campaigns and elections, or else we will be facing something closer to a dictatorship in our country. I don't mean it just in the city of Detroit. I'm talking about across this country. We have elected two presidents by almost a minority vote.
Ed Davis began selling Studebakers in 1947.
Was a dealer.
Was a dealer
in 1947.
Okay, now young people, old people, remember that. Now we've learned some history here.
You got to understand that
in 1947 sold Studebakers.
In Detroit, I think the guy who used to work for the Al Merritt was the first black to work in a franchise selling automobiles.
And I'd like to quote you. In short, our capitalist civilization is killing our minds, bodies, and souls in the name of the American dream. Explain.
Well, I think since 1974, this country embarked on an unprecedented historic experiment. It allowed markets to run amok, unregulated, unfettered, unedited, penetrating every nook and cranny of our lives.
So of course I've seen that clip many times, and it's wonderful to see all the old hosts and all the guests, but my favorite part every time is the look on former Mayor Coleman Young's face when he is talking to Ed Gordon. You can see what he's about to say to him next, right? Joining me now are three past hosts. 9:10 a.m. radio personality Lavonia Perryman, who took over from Tony Brown in the early 1970s. Trudy Gallant-Stokes hosted in the mid to late 1980s and is now the owner of a production company. And who could forget Detroit NAACP President Reverend Wendell Anthony, who served as a guest host on the show. And of course, whenever he's on the show, when I'm there, I'm always like, well, he's really hosting. I'm just sitting here, right? Let's talk about how the show has changed over the years. Lavonia, what were some of the things that were hot topics when you were on? And I always wonder, do you see us doing those same topics now?
Redlining was one.
Yeah.
Still doing that.
Still talking about
Still
that,
talking about
right?
housing, poverty, injustice in Detroit.
Yeah.
Education. We're moving forward, but we're having stronger and longer conversations. But the change is seeing the individuals who are in the State House and running the government, those individuals. But we're still having the same conversation.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you took over the show from Tony.
Right. I actually, believe it or not, Tony Brown was there when I graduated from college. And he actually became the first dean of Howard University School of Communication. He was the first dean, and so he left, and I was there, and I was actually an intern, and I was in backstage doing whatever they wanted me to do, serve coffee, wipe their brows, put on lipstick, all those sort of things. And so I was the little black girl that was there. And they figured out I could talk. I could write. And I could smile. And so they said, why not? And there was a young man named Mr. George Martin. Mr. George Martin, absolutely, who said, he was the producer. And he said, why don't we give you a try? And so I did that. And I took it by the bull by the horn. And I never let it go.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Trudy, you hosted in a different era.
Yes.
Talk about some of the things that were pressing issues then, and again, are we still talking about the same things now?
Unfortunately, we still are. I actually was the producer when Ed Gordon was the host, and then I became host when he went to BET. And yeah, we had a 1-hour special about the crack crisis in the community. Specials on public education, and certainly we're, still dealing with that. So yeah, the more things change. The other nice thing, though, we often would have some entertainment guests. I can remember Anita Baker in her early days, and she came on the show and, blew up and became fabulous, and Natalie Cole. So we had a cross-section.
Yeah. Reverend Anthony, you've been a fixture in this community for a really long time. Somebody I think we all look to as kind of the temperature taker of what's going on, what's important, what we should be talking about and thinking about. Talk about the times when you hosted the show and sort of how this show fits into that larger context of the important work you do.
Well, first of all, Stephen, let me thank you and American Black Journal and the station for pausing to reflect 50 years hence since 1968. It is so important that we do not forget to remember. It is very, very important. And I'm glad to be here with these beautiful ladies who represent the best of what came out of that. I have to pay tribute to Tony Brown because it was Tony Brown's image and his vision and his thinking. Many of us may remember, or sometimes we forget, Tony Brown was also instrumental in helping to facilitate the first march of Dr. King in Detroit when he did his I Have a Dream speech. So he came, and Tony Brown was the parade marshal, if I can use that terminology. But Black Journal came at a time period when this nation was at very critical stages. In 1968, I was just coming out of Central High School. And later on, my first trip to Africa was in 1970. And a lot of the discussion on Black Journal was around the emerging African nations. I was in the Pan-African Congress. A lot of discussion was on Tricky Dick Nixon and the Vietnam War. A lot of discussion emanated around the passing and the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Where do we go from here? We talked about divesting from South Africa in terms of the apartheid regime and what was going on. We talked about the Black Panther Party and what was going on at that time. There was two programs that really crystallized the Black diaspora and the Black sense of consciousness and being. One of them was Black Journal, National Black Journal, and the other was Soul. Some people forget Soul, but Soul was a program that came on and it presented artists, it presented activists, politicians that had never been seen. Black Journal gave us an opportunity to touch base with people that the other networks were not hearing. It gave a platform for some thorough discussion about in-depth issues that 247 and 50 were not doing at that time. And so along comes Black Journal. And we rode that horse as long as we could ride it because we didn't have no other horse, and it was a black horse, and that was a horse that we ran. And so it was a good piece, Stephen, and it's unfortunate that we don't have a whole lot of that today. American Black Journal is continuing that tradition, but it came out of the very crucible of the afflicted Black condition, and to speak to those areas which heretofore we had not had a platform to talk about. And so I just thank the Almighty for what it did and for the foundation that it laid. So all the talk shows that you see now, all the radio shows, all the stuff that you see on Sirius Radio, were it not for a Black Journal and a Tony Brown, you would not be seeing those things today. Wow.
And that's probably the key.
Yeah, go ahead, Trudy.
Is in-depth discussion,
Yeah.
not just kind of skating over the surface, but really spending time. Because the other issue I remember is we were discussing casino gambling, and that was a big issue in the late '80s, and trying to decide what was going to happen. So you had to have some place to have that avenue to bring all the differing opinions and hear from everybody.
We were still discussing back then police brutality.
Right.
Absolutely.
And we know about, if you were here, what was going on at that time was everybody was under siege. The city was under siege.
Absolutely.
But we were able to have a discussion in depth, and it was called Detroit Black Journal at that time.
Because there was so much happening in Detroit. I mean, you had the New Bethel Baptist Church incident. You had the Nation of Islam. You had the artists that were really at the very edge of what I call edutainment. They were educating and entertaining at the same time. Rashawn Roland Kirk. You had folk like that. You had Aretha. You had people that they not only sang, but they could talk.
That's right.
And they had a critique about our condition, our struggle. George Martin did a great job back then as the Detroit Black Journal host. And Detroit was featured. Detroit was the mecca of Black activism and activity. And we need not forget that, because a whole lot of stuff came out of Detroit. We're the first when it comes to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. We are the first when it comes to the kind of musicology that emanated from the Black church. We are the first when it comes to Black folk emerging in the middle class through the UAW and the auto. And we are the first when it comes to Black folk who are being professionalized through the various professional sororities and fraternities and police departments and force. We had one of the first Black mayors who really did not mind telling you where to go. I mean, it was so much that came out of Detroit. And so when we think of Detroit, it really is a big D.
Right. And there was another specific first in terms of CPT, and that was they had the kind of pretend commercials
Yes.
that George
Yes.
Martin did.
Uh-huh.
And I understand that they were the forerunners before even Saturday Night Live started to do
The
that.
spoofing
And they were
commercial, yeah.
spoofing commercials, but those commercials had a message.
They did.
And if you were paying attention, they, you know, it was a great way to handle it and slide in, like you said, that infotainment, that information.
Right,
And
another
you had a
thing,
message.
it gave, Black Journal gave many people who are around the world and around the country today their
start.
launch off point.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about Ed Gordon.
Ed Gordon,
I mean,
yeah.
we're talking about Tony Brown.
Right.
Yeah.
With the people that are sitting here, and many, many people who are around the country. We're talking about Donnie Simpson. I mean, you know, right?
Absolutely.
There are so many folk who are in the business today because of Black Journal.
Right.
Yeah.
I used to do commentaries, Stephen. One of my jobs was doing commentary. I did commentaries on basically everything, and I had free
I'm shocked
control.
by that.
I mean, it was a time period when we had what we called the black exploitation films. And some of y'all remember Superfly. And I remember doing a big commentary on Superfly. I talked about Superfly, what he really needed was a Superfly swallow, because that was not what we were about. I mean, all the films because at that time, the black exploitation films were not the kind of films that inspired us. They really mocked us in a certain way and in a certain caricature, even though black folk were making money, but they weren't controlling it. Right. And so it was an era, Stephen, as you know, that was really popping. The whole black consciousness, nationalist kind of a thrust. The Shrine of the Black Madonna was preeminent. The whole thing of black Christian nationalism was emerging during that era. It was a real precious era. And now we're in a new era. And we're in an era of 45. And so that means that we need an American Black Journal
to talk about all
put
that.
some blackness. Right. We need an American Black Journal to put some blackness on this whiteness relative to really making certain that folk understand the times, the critical times that we're in, because our children, unfortunately, they did not see that. They were not a part of that. And had they been a part of that, some of the things that have happened may not have happened today. And it was on that foundation that a lot of people emerged and stood and still stand as a result of what went down here.
So you notice I only had to ask one question of this panel, right? You get a panel of hosts, and they take over your show.
Well, there's a host that we haven't talked about who is very crucial to all of this, and that's Ron Scott.
Ron Scott. Yeah.
And when you talk about a foundation
Absolutely.
and a person who was politically active and really made a difference, Ron Scott was that person.
We miss Ron.
Yes.
Absolutely. And there was one little side note, and I know some of the sisters could appreciate this. It was the only place that a woman with an afro
could be on TV.
could be on television.
Yeah.
Only place.
Right.
And probably the country. But I know it was the only place.
Well, you see, I'm trying to do my part now.
Right. It's the only place.
And see, even in those days, they didn't even put makeup on you. They just let you come on and be black.
That's
just like
right.
you was.
That's right. Be your natural self, right?
So.
Only place.
Right. Well, it's great to see all three of you. And
Our
thank
pleasure.
you for what you did to make possible what I try to do every week.
And Stephen, we thank you for keeping it alive,
That's
man.
right.
You're doing a great job.
Absolutely.
Thank you for bringing it to the people.
Thank you very
Keeping
much.
it going.
Thank you.
That means so much. Okay, so tonight we're saluting the legacy of American Black Journal while looking ahead to the future. It's a reunion of sorts, bringing together the people who had an impact on the show and the African American community. Here's Detroit School Board member Misha Stallworth.
You know what I love about reunions? It's the stories. When my cousin comes home from living in Japan or living in South Africa, Shaka tells me the stories. He tells me the things that he loved. He tells me the things that he experienced. Or when my older brother Tommy has a family barbecue, we end up inevitably talking about the stories when we were growing up. What were our parents like? What was our home like? Stories change our lives. When we go through a moral dilemma, we look to stories to help us choose. We tell stories after we've come to our conclusion and made our decision. When we have grief, our stories help us to process. And when we fall in love, it's usually after we've exchanged the most vulnerable of our stories. Stories can change our communities. They are an inevitable part of the human experience. And so when I think about these stories, I think about people like Ida B. Wells, who told stories of the lynchings across the South, who united Black people in their grief and denounced a mainstream message about what they were experiencing. I think about people like Gloria Steinem, who borrowed the practice of circle storytelling from Indigenous people. And at the National Women's Convention, women of all experiences and backgrounds, and especially women of color, were able to share their stories and inform a political agenda. And I think of a story that's very special to my heart. It's one that my grandmother told me, former State Representative Alma G. Stallworth. She told me a story about a woman who was a church secretary and very concerned about zoning and education in her neighborhood. And she told me a story about showing up at a community meeting and seeing her elected representatives and thinking to herself, I could do that. And then she told me a story about running for that seat with no previous experience and then being able to serve for 22 years. And so when the opportunity came for me to run for office, it was that story that fueled me and encouraged me and made me think, I could do that too. Our stories are power. Our stories can change the world. And so when you leave here tonight, when you get home and you sit on your couch and unwind from your long night, and you sit with your family, or over the weekend when you have brunch for some of us, or you go to church, sit next to someone you've never talked to before, or sit next to someone you've talked to 1,000,000 times and ask them, will you tell me a story?
That was Anita Dumar. She is... Colored People's Time debuted as a weekly show funded by the Junior League of Detroit, Wayne State University, and New Detroit. Gilbert Maddox and Tony Brown led the original production of the show. The idea was black programming by and for African Americans. My next guests have been called upon many times on the show to offer their viewpoint. Please welcome former Detroit Mayor Dave Bing. And next to him is financial journalist Kelvin Boston. All right, I'm going to start off by embarrassing them just a little bit. We have some video of their many appearances on the show. Let's start with Dave Bing.
Live from the studios of WTVS, Detroit Black Journal proudly continues 16 award-winning years of history, news, and current affairs from a black perspective.
You found a corporation that needed to supply for others. Now, many blacks do not necessarily do that, or for some time they did not. They had traditional black businesses. Is it important that we move past that and start to grow into other areas? Is that why you picked steel, perhaps?
I think so, without a doubt, because in steel, it was something that obviously is non-traditional vis-a-vis what most blacks may venture into in terms of business. And I saw an opportunity here in this city where it was a major, major business. It's a support system to the big automotive industry, and I saw an opportunity to get involved into something that could accrue major dollars for me, which would help me leverage myself to diversify into some other areas.
Okay, next, yeah, go ahead. Next, let's take a look at Kelvin Boston.
Blacks spend 84.4% of their total living expenses as compared with 82.9% of whites or for whites. Why do blacks spend so much more money than they make?
Well, a lot of time we're not really looking at how to save. We're not looking at how to get the best price for our best value for our investments. For instance, I remember a couple of years ago, a lot of people were buying Mercedes-Benz, and African Americans were buying them because they thought it was status conscious. White Americans were buying because they were good automobiles, and they knew if they had a Mercedes-Benz, then that car would last for 10 years.
Okay, you notice in those clips, their hair is longer than it is now. And if you saw clips of me from then, my hair would be shorter than it is now. So welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So, Mr. Mayor, you've got this incredible narrative across many decades in this community that takes you from sports, a Hall of Fame career with the Detroit Pistons, to the business world, then to the world of politics. And this show was there for almost all of it. And you appeared on the show several times. Can you talk about that sort of evolution in this community and sort of the role that spaces like American Black Journal afforded people like you?
Well, I think the sports career was one that's short-lived. And I enjoyed it, but at the same token, you really didn't help people from a sports standpoint. I think the greatest thing that I did was starting my own business and then hiring over 1,300 people. And 80% of those people were Detroiters, which means they were black.
Right.
And so I was told early on that you can't be successful with a business in Detroit because Detroit does not have the wherewithal to give you the kind of people that's going to help you grow your business. And that's a fallacy. Without those people, I never would have grown to the success level that I had. You know, I never wanted to be, and don't think I was a politician. But I was called at a time when I think the city needed a change, and I stepped up to the table, and it was the most tumultuous 4.5 years of my life. But as I look back on it, and people ask me, if you had to make that decision again, would you do it? And my answer is yes, because I think our city was on the cusp of either failing or trying to make a correction. And I think we made a correction. In those 4.5 years, one of the things that I think I enjoyed most was getting to know so many people in city government, because they were lambasted for not being smart, for being lazy, not working hard, and taking our city down the tubes. And that really wasn't the case. There was a lot of good people, they worked hard, and I made a lot of friendships that are lasting today. And I think a lot of what's going on today started in that administration. And I don't take credit for that. I look at the people who were there that took major hits, major pay cuts in their benefits. And without them doing that, this city would not be where it is today.
Yeah, we would be in a lot of trouble. So when you start the business and that eventually becomes Bing Steel, which I think when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, that was such a familiar name. You know, as I think it was Ed who was talking to you on the program said, that's just not the kind of thing African Americans were doing. Where did you find support? Where did you find sort of that reinforcing strength to do that and know that, okay, well, maybe this is not what everyone else is doing, but I think this will work?
Well, there were no African Americans in steel. And in Detroit, as the automotive capital of the world at that time, the primary product into a vehicle is steel. And I said, you know, I went and I got into a company where I trained for a couple of years, learned the business, and said, I want to do this myself. I always wanted to own my own business, and I think that's something that we as a community need to strive for, because that's the ultimate, in my opinion, of success. And it's a great avenue to maximize your earning capacity. And then you also can hire who you want to hire and give them opportunities. And that's what happened with me. As I said, 80% of my employees were African American. And it was generational because I was in the business for 29 years. And so I had kids of parents that worked for me also, and we were a family. And you know, the automotive industry is very difficult, but in the car companies, GM, Ford, and Chrysler at that time were promoting minority suppliers. But most of the suppliers stayed away from the really hard stuff. You know, they did maybe transportation, or they did maybe some IT, they did different things. I wanted to be in the mix of making a product that goes into the vehicle. And so from a steel perspective, we were in raw steel, then we got into stampings where you're actually making parts for the vehicles. Then I did a joint venture with Lear Corporation where we started producing seats and exterior mirrors. So we were doing a lot of different things in the automotive industry that was kind of unheard of at that time. And we grew a company from a startup with 4 people to a company that got about 1,300 people and $2 million in sales my first year. And I ended up over 300 million, by the end of my 29 years. And then it was time to move on and try to enjoy myself. Then I made the mistake when they said, well, we want you to be mayor.
No, you said you would do it again.
And I would. But that's another story.
Yeah.
And I tell you, I learned more about the city of Detroit in that 4.5 years. And I've been here 53 years. I'm not a native Detroiter, wasn't born here, born in Washington, D.C., another great city. But all my adult life, I've been here. So I've made a lot of friends, and there are a lot of people that helped me along the way. So everything that I am today, I owe Detroit a great deal for my success.
Yeah, go ahead. Kelvin, in that clip, one of the things that you're getting at is the importance of financial literacy, right? The idea of understanding not just how to earn money, but how to spend it wisely and how to make it work for you. It strikes me that I think that clip is from the 90s. Now we're in the teens of the next century. We could maybe have a show tomorrow talking about some of those same things.
Yeah, I think the clip is still relevant today because not only African Americans, but all Americans today need to understand how to manage their resources more effectively. Mm-hmm. The reality is that right now, too many of us, again, both white and black, are buying things sometimes we can't afford, to do things we don't need to do to impress people that we don't even like. It's important. It's important, especially right now when we think that after 10 years our economy is about to slow down. Mm-hmm. And if you understand, especially in Detroit, we have many ups and downs, that when white America has a cold, black America has a flu, and sometimes we die from the flu. And so right now it's important for us, while we have a little bit of gain and while Detroit is on its way back up, that we understand now is the time for us to buy our homes, to save more, to have jobs that are related to the digital economy, and understand that, as someone once said, that at the bottom of business, at the bottom of politics, even at the bottom of religion, there must be economic freedom. Wow.
And so you have worked in a number of different places over several decades. I wonder what you make of progress on that front. The idea of independence and economic freedom. Are we doing better with that?
Well, in some ways we're doing better, but unfortunately for black Americans, we're going backwards. In fact, there's one study that says that even though our collective assets and ability to earn has gone up, then in about 20 years, black America might have a zero net worth. Wow. So we're going backwards. And that's because we, again, are buying things, but we're not buying things that appreciate, and we're not buying things that make us money over the long term. Mm-hmm. But I think most important to me is when I look back at that clip and realize where I have come. Back then, when we talked about black economic empowerment, we basically focused on wealth building. Mm-hmm. Today, I can't talk about black economic empowerment or empowering anybody financially without talking about the relationship between health and wealth. There's a direct relationship. Sure. What's keeping most of us from being financially secure is the fact that our health is so poor that we're dying young. And we don't have the opportunity to overcome that so that we can save more. Wow. I can't talk to black people or anybody about becoming successful without mentioning that they need to be a part of the digital economy. If you're still dealing with the service economy, trying to deal with people one-on-one, then you're not connected to the digital economy. Therefore, you will be out of work and out of business very, very soon. I have to talk about the fact that every black family must own a business today. Mm-hmm. Somebody in that family, brother, mother, sister, somebody has to own a business. Then we have to talk about education And most important, we have to talk about motivation. Unfortunately, our good friend, Reverend Holly, couldn't be here with us tonight. But I must say on his behalf, we have to understand where our abundance comes from, where our prosperity comes from. Because you can be up at any moment and then be down. And when those things happen, you need something that you can hold on to that's bigger than you and better than you and stronger than you, and that's wherever your faith comes from. And I believe that God wants us to have abundance. He wants us to have it right now. So, but that's where I think we are. This is a great opportunity. One last thing. I know that Detroit is going through what some people call gentrification, but it's beyond gentrification. See, when Whole Foods moves into your neighborhood, gentrification is over. They're not the first.
It's already happened.
They're the last to come. But there is something that's going on called rapid urbanization that's happening all over America. And basically it means that most American cities are going to double in size next 5 to 10 years. And that's what's happening in Detroit. So Baltimore will become the size of Washington, D.C. Detroit will become the size of New York. New York will double in size. So what does that mean? That means there's so much opportunity right now that we need to be hopeful about, because property values are going to go up. There are going to be more jobs in Detroit and more business opportunities, but only if we're prepared to take advantage of them. And that's where we are right now. And one last thing, I think for Black America, the thing that we have going for us most is that America as a society is on the wrong side of the immigration question. The fact is that our population is getting older.
Right.
So that means there could be more jobs and opportunities. We got about 10 years for Black folks to understand that. That any job in America you want is up. You can have that job in about 10 years. But you got to prepare for it.
But you have to be prepared for it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. All right.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Wonderfully. Okay, Mayor Dave Bain, Kelvin Boston, thanks for being here. Thanks for all you've done for the program over the years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, one of my favorite people in the city of Detroit, another personal reflection on what's brought us together tonight. Here's Satori Shakur from the Secret Society of Twisted Storytellers.
Thank you. Were you there when they shot my son Trayvon? Were you there when they shot my son Trayvon? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they shot my son Trayvon? Were you there when they left him on the lawn? Were you there when he said he stood his ground? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, 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 tremble. I can't breathe since they left him on the lawn. Were you there when they shamed his name in court? Were you there when they shamed his name in court? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. I can't breathe since they shamed his name in court. Were you there when not guilty was his plea? Were you there when they let George Z go free? Oh, Sometimes it causes me to rise up, stand up, rise up. ABGA, Black Lives Matter, 50 years.
I want to take the time to celebrate and congratulate American Black Journal. 50 years of doing serious, sustained analysis, representation of the people, talking earnestly about serious issues of race, class, increasingly gender, sexual orientation, the things that matter to Black people, the things that matter to Black Detroit, the things that matter to Black America. We thank God for their persistence, and we celebrate them and encourage them to go for another 50 years to tell the truth, to be on the cutting edge, and to represent the best of our thought. Thank you, American Black Journal, for all the great things you do.
Yo, what up? This is Big Snoop Dogg sending a happy 50th anniversary to American Black Journal. Keep on keeping on. You dig?
So I want to just take a minute and just let us take in what we heard from Satori just a few minutes ago. If your eyes were dry during that, I don't know how you did it. I'm always reminded of the weight of history on this program and the work that we do, but that was a perfect intonation of those feelings. So again, Satori, I don't know if you're still here. Thanks so much for that. So it's been my real pleasure to host American Black Journal for the past 10 years. Yes, I have been the host for 10 years, not 50, as some people have asked me. Every week we bring you news, information, culture, and entertainment from an African-American perspective. While our purpose has remained the same over the years, some things have changed, including me, during my tenure as host. Well, I'll let the pictures tell you the story. Take a look. Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. Happy New Year. 2011 is a year without huge elections, but we welcome a new governor and legislature. This year's Ford Freedom Award will honor 3 African-American heroes who've demonstrated the power of perseverance. Our salute to Detroit's Black history continues today with a woman who became the first African-American female judge. The nation's largest study of African-Americans with cancer is taking place right here in Detroit. Detroit's first Independence Bank is now the 7th largest African-American controlled bank in the country. That's our program for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. As you can see, the clothes are getting less and less big, and my hair is getting bigger and bigger. The studio sets at Detroit Public Television and the opening sequence of the program also have changed over the past 50 years. We put together a short clip to show how the production evolved with the times. Take a look.
Good evening. I'm Tony Brown. Welcome to CPT.
Our guest for tonight is one of the survivors of the struggle of the last 10 years. That's Bobby Seale.
Thank you.
Okay.
For over 30 years, the husband and wife team of Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee have been golden names to audiences the world over.
Hello, Detroit Black Journal, you're on the air.
Hello, I'm a University of Detroit student.
Hi, this is Susan. I heard what you just said, and I disagree.
Well, I wanted to talk to you.
I have a question to ask. Right.
But I'd like to respond to that.
Good evening, I'm Ed Gordon. Tonight we start a special 2-part conversation with the Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Good evening, I'm Chauncey Bailey, guest host tonight for this third special Detroit Black Journal City for Youth edition. Tonight we focus on black images, stereotypes, and the media.
Welcome to Detroit Black Journal. I'm your host, Cliff Russell. We're very pleased on Detroit Black Journal to have with us Miss Barbara Talley, who has already broken some political ground in the city of Southfield.
Next on American Black Journal, a look inside the heart of a champion when we go one-on-one with Isaiah Thomas. The capstone of his 13-year career with the Detroit Pistons was back-to-back championship seasons.
Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm very pleased to welcome Detroit Mayor Dave Bing to ABJ.
Good to be here.
Dave Bing on the show again. So here with me now are two people who had major roles in the production of Detroit Black Journal. Wayne State University professor Juanita Anderson was executive producer of the show from 1982 to 1988. Let's welcome her to the program. And videographer and editor Tony Motley was producer from 1993 to 2009. And if I'm not mistaken, he was my first producer on the show. I think you were. Wow. So you guys are the ones who make the show work, right? I always say that people know who the host is and they know who the guests are because they see us, but they don't see all the work that goes into presenting that and making it actually work in front of the camera. Talk about the importance of that role on this show over the years, and whether there's something special about being the producer of Detroit Black Journal or American Black Journal that separates other work that you've done. I'll start with you, Juanita.
Well, I've actually had the privilege of working on two of the three longest running African-American public television shows, Detroit Black Journal and Say Brother in Boston. So
wow.
There are a few similarities that go there. But I think from my vantage point, when I came to Detroit in 1982, I had been working at a small station in Southern Illinois called WSIU, which not only serves Southern Illinois, but Paducah, Kentucky, and Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and I'm pointing backwards because I'm dyslexic a little bit, in terms of what is East and West, but also doing Black programming there. And I think that what became important was that you had Black people at the helm of the show who were making decisions about what was the topic, what was the content, who was going to be on it, where you were going to shoot. And I think that that was in the spirit of what Black Journal, CPT, and shows like Say Brother and Black Horizons in Pittsburgh were founded upon. This notion that we were creating programming by, for, and about the Black community. And what that meant was we were not trying to exclude any audience, but we were trying to speak to Black people first and foremost from the vantage point of Black people. And you can't do that without Black producers.
Without Black producers, sure, yeah. Tony? Oh, go ahead.
For me, being a young producer when I started and working with Cato, and then we saw Cliff Russell, my man Cliff, God bless him.
And we have to talk, excuse me for interrupting you, but Cato Weatherspoon was the very first Black director in the city of Detroit.
Right, wow.
And we owe him a major debt of gratitude for all of his years of service with Detroit Black Journal.
Absolutely. I think to get an idea to the screen was difficult because there were so many concerned Black folks that were going to check you and make sure that the right person was on to talk about that subject and you spoke about it properly. My mother was a good friend of Dr. Charles Wright's, My mother had great friends in the black community. I was Dorothy's son. I could not embarrass my family on television. So coming here, doing this show, it was a rite of passage. And for people like Juanita, like Kata Witherspoon, Jim Woods, Gerald Smith, other people that were involved with the show, you had to get their approval, or you would be checked. And so, but it's really about us being able to tell our own stories in a way that mattered to us with that kind of authentic voice, and in spite of whoever didn't like it.
Right, right.
And the lens mattered. It wasn't only the producers. It's the fact that we had black directors, that Jim Woods was the director of photography for very much of our location shoots. I remember, because I came in as executive producer of cultural affairs, so I did arts and culture programming from various vantage points. But we did a program with the BBC Wales who wanted to look at gospel music from a very British vantage point. And we sort of had to dissuade them from that notion. But they had come to Motortown looking for the ghetto.
Where gospel music comes from. Right?
And got very incensed that I could not, my production assistant would not show them the ghetto that they were looking for, because it just didn't exist. Not in Detroit at any rate. But I recall that we brought in native Detroiter Donald Vales, who was living in Washington, D.C. at that time. And I sent a crew out to the airport to cover Donald's arrival at the airport. Much to my surprise, it was a white cameraman, but his lens and the way he saw black people in the world was very different than I saw it. So I'm expecting to see a close-up shot of Reverend Vales coming in, and we follow him down as he moves from and at that time you really could shoot at the gate.
At the gate.
But what I got back was this extreme wide shot with one single black person sort of moving through it. And I mean, that was his lens. My sensibility as a black person says, you follow the person that you're covering, not see one white person walking through a crowd of white people, one black person walking through a crowd of white people. Different gaze, and that's really important.
I think the thing you learn behind the scenes about television is that you see that woman with one tooth and rollers in her hair on the 6 o'clock news, and you wonder, how did that happen? Right. And then you realize that as a producer, when you're in the field with these different people from all walks of life, you may ask someone else for that soundbite. Right. You may ask somebody, maybe they want to fix their hair or cover up something, but you have dignity about the people that you deal with, and you want to present them in a way that doesn't disrespect them. Yeah. And that's what's important.
Yeah. So as the current host of the show, I know that sometimes I get crosswise with my producer, right? Sometimes she wants to do something one way and I want to do it another. Can you talk some about that relationship between the producer and the host, and how
Daryl
important
Wood,
it is?
with Cliff, I'm surprised we never came to blows. We got as close to a fist fight as you could possibly ever get without having it happen. I mean, people driving away from the building mad, people not talking to each other. It was crazy, but it's just part of the process. Yeah. It really is.
See, I didn't have that issue.
No?
No, because we didn't have a host.
You got off easy.
Well, that's one way to solve that problem.
When I came to Detroit Black Journal, there really was no one who could replace Ron Scott. Ron was a cultural critic, a community activist, a journalist, an intellect who could talk to and about anything. He was not a star. He understood that his responsibility was to elicit and get stories from the people that were on the set with him, and that was why he was there, and that was why they were there. So,
and he did it so cool.
So
right?
cool.
When I look at
just,
old clips, he is the coolest host who was ever on this this program.
That's who he was, though.
Yeah.
Really,
yeah.
So when I came on board, we had a very talented producer, Deborah Ray, who we wanted to stretch. We wanted to focus on content. So we made the decision to go to a once-a-month hourly format, which allowed us to use the resources that we had to have more production values. We did a lot of documentary-style work or big studio performance pieces, and really focused on the subject matter at hand, rather than getting into arguments with hosts.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you, I mean, you and I understand both sides of this, Stephen, and it's probably your fault. Because
it's always my fault.
The talent, I mean, the question was always, who's on the show this week? Why are we doing this?
That's right. Why are we doing this way, right?
And so that's just part of it. I think that actually makes the show better. Yeah. That's just part of the game.
So before we end,
Just
go ahead.
to add to that, I mean, I think that the synergy of a group of Black people working together, whether it's host and producer and director and director of photography or sound person, you have to discuss, you have to challenge each other. Yeah. And that was the magic of Detroit Black Journal during the time that I worked there.
We don't all think the same
thing. We don't all think
Imagine
alike?
that.
Yeah, right.
Imagine that.
So I'm curious also about this idea, we saw a little bit in the clip, the idea of live call-ins on the show. Now, I host a radio show where we take phone calls, and many days I say, it's a good thing there's not a camera in this room to see my face, my reaction to the callers. How did you manage that with live TV?
I didn't do it.
You didn't do it.
Okay. I am responsible for killing the live
call.
Killed
the phone call.
I didn't, and it was my aesthetic. I didn't like it.
Yeah.
So
it seems odd for television. Was that part of the show when you produced it? It wasn't. Okay. I'll have to ask. I'll have to find the people who are responsible.
Do something
for that.
different. I wanted to do like Juanita did. I wanted to do something different, and I think that's the producer's right to do that. To change the game.
Cast
if you feel
the
like
show
it.
in a different direction.
Right.
Sure.
But you know, I was thinking about some of the in-depth programs that we did, and I realized that even though I was working here in the 1980s, some of the issues still remain the same. Sure. We won an Emmy for Public Education, a Community Crisis.
And it's still going on.
We did an hour on the technological revolution. And at that time, computers were just coming to our desktops. In fact, I had to fight to get one at Detroit Public Television. But we really wanted to take a look at whether or not Black children were being prepared and had the resources to deal with science and engineering and technology. And here we are today. I mean, and there were role models at that time. DAPSEP, the DAPSEP program was one of the leading programs in science at that time, science and math. So, but we look in the same issues of resources and accessibility to technology are still pervasive in our communities. And there's still a need for us to really continue to address and insist in change. That narrative.
And in this kind of space, in that Black space that this show creates.
It's a sensitive subject, but it is interesting because if you look at the beginning, there's a Tony Brown or there's an early 1968, 69 version of Black Journal where they're talking about public education.
Yes,
and it's just...
Yeah, they're talking to students at Northern High School who are talking about conditions that you might find in public schools today. Yeah. All right, Juanita Anderson, Tony Motley.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. We've kind of hinted at this all night, but as we look back at the past 50 years, we really want to pay tribute to the people we've lost. They left an indelible mark through their contributions to American Black Journal, Detroit Black Journal, and Colored People's Time.
Can it be that it was all so simple then? Or has time rewritten every line? And if we had the chance to do it all again, tell me, would we? Could we? Memories like the corners of my mind. Misty waters color memories of the way we were. Scattered pictures of the smiles we left behind, smiles we gave to one another, of the way we were. Oh, can it be that it was all so simple then? Or has time rewritten every line? And if we had the chance to do it all again, tell me, would we? Could we? Memories can be beautiful and yet much too painful to remember. We simply choose to forget. Oh, but it's the laughter we will remember. The way we were. Do, 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 do.
So our featured guest tonight is no stranger to Detroit. She was the president and CEO of the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History from 1999 to 2005. Now she heads up the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. It's the country's first museum to explore the history of the Civil War from the perspectives of the Union, the Confederacy, and of course, African Americans. Please welcome Christy Coleman. Hello. It's nice to see you. Thanks very much. So welcome back to Detroit. Welcome home, right?
Thank you. It's been great seeing everybody.
Yeah, the theme tonight is reunion, and you are at the center of that in some ways. Let's start by talking about the Civil War Museum, and as I said, this idea of telling that story from these different perspectives and trying to make sure that you are telling it from truthful perspectives, which I know is not always easy.
Right. So, so when I left Detroit, I went home to Virginia, and this opportunity is what sent me home to Virginia because. Let me tell you something. If you grow up in Virginia, there is just a certain kind of thing there, and you know, and depending on what part of the state you're in, it kind of depends on your experience. And so Central Virginia, Richmond, was, there's a phrase I use called the Confederati had in control of it for a long time. And so the idea that there was this new museum there that was exploring the Civil War from Union, Confederate, and African American perspectives, in my mind, was absolutely gutsy, especially in the former capital of the Confederacy. And so that was very appealing to me. And needless to say, when I came into that job, there was a lot of curiosity, right? A lot of curiosity. You know, black folk were like, wait a minute, hold up, wait, what? Right? And then they're like, but didn't she run to Charles Wright in Detroit? Wait a minute, what? Why is she messing with the Civil War, right? And you know, and white folks who were more moderate were like, well, this could be interesting, right? And of course, the Confederati were losing their mind, right? They were like, oh my God, you know, she's gonna bash everything that has to do with the Confederacy, and she's gonna, you know, she's just gonna be like this black person. So, and I ended up kind of being all of those things. So, you know,
some
it's
easier than
yeah,
others.
some easier,
right?
some definitely easier than others. But at the end of the day, it's about truth, right? And so, you know, there's such a deliberate attempt to remove African American agency during the course of the war from this false narrative of a unified South, which always fascinates me. The people who secede actually have others who secede from them. You know, that's how we get West Virginia. You know, we get Jones County, Mississippi. We get all of these, you know, Unionists that are in the South, and subsequently whites in the North who were just as much embracing white supremacy and slavery at the time, known as Copperheads. So the history has never been easy. And my contention in all of the work that I've done in this now 30-plus year career has been we can't get right with each other if we don't get the history right. And so that's sort of my thing.
So, are we right with each other?
Oh, of course not.
I mean, that seems like such a wonderful idea,
Right.
but I can think of so many examples where we're just coming up
We're just not
short.
there.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, because, so here's the thing. I mean, for those of us that work in museums, we have to navigate this very interesting confluence between history, heritage, and memory. So the history is what actually happened. What does the historical record tell us? The heritage is what we have chosen to tell each other to get through it. And the problem is what we tell each other is often incorrect, and it is designed to provide a momentary comfort. You know, and I tell people, I give an example of, you know, how many of us grew up hearing George Washington could never tell a lie and had wooden teeth, right? Well, of course he could lie. He was a human being, right? And as far as the wooden teeth is concerned, it's far more complicated when you realize that they weren't wooden at all. They were either ivory or they were the teeth from enslaved people. And that adds a whole different level of complexity to our understanding of the father of our country. And so when you get to the American Civil War, it's even more complex. So no, we absolutely aren't right with each other. And even in our African American community, one of the things when I was working here at the Wright, one of the things was navigating this idea that we had a unified black community. You know, I knew better than that. But I knew that each of the voices was important, and before we could do anything, before we could even create And Still We Rise, it was important for me to hear what the community needed. So again, this idea of history and heritage. What did Detroit need? And what I heard resoundingly was Detroit needed to see itself in its rightful place in a national narrative of black progress. So that's what we really worked hard to do with And Still We Rise. And then this third thing is about memory. And that's where there's personal connection to the past, right? And we all have those stories, whether it's the ancestor that we sat on the porch listening to things, whether it was the experience of seeing for the first time. You know, people used to tell me how powerful it was for them when the African American Museum used to be where the College of Creative CCS is, when it was across the street, and how people really resonated with this little cutout of the slave ship, right? And they would tell these stories to me, or they would tell the stories to me about how going to Dr. Wright's office and all of the artifacts that he had when they were coming in to have him check them out and their babies. And so museums, again, we have to navigate all of that so that we are impactful. And I think that for too many years, the mainstream of the field, anyway, we're not taking the lessons that we had learned in ethnic-specific museums, and that is, you can't matter if you don't matter. And so they were so busy trying to be objective that they weren't helping communities when we were in crisis. So now, I think that's part of the reason why people have been paying so much attention to the American Civil War Museum because of the work we've been doing in this work. Yeah. So communities around the country, whether they're dealing with Confederate statuary on the landscape or trying to navigate the false narrative of states' rights as a cause of the Civil War, or whether, there's this sort of hyper-black thing that's saying, well, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't do anything for black people, which is another fallacy, when it did so much. The biggest piece is allowing African-American men to serve to the tune of 200,000, and the fact that 1 million African-Americans will run away within 18 months. Because of this, and gain their freedom, and so, or take their freedom. So the Civil War still plays out in American life. We have a political party that is essentially doing the exact political playbook right now. When you look at the historical record, it is extraordinary what is happening, and so that's why we've managed to get a little attention down there in Richmond about what we're doing lately. Stirring the pot a little bit. No, not stirring the pot. I mean, we're just doing what we're supposed to do to begin with, right?
Well, but I do think there is something about the idea of, and I'm really curious about this from just a museum perspective. So you're trying to tell a complex story at a time when most people are attracted to simplicity, and maybe more than at any recent time in American history, when people don't want to hear that there's nuance to that thing that they think is true. They don't want to hear that there might be another way to think about things. And you're at a museum where you're saying, no, you really do have to think about these things. You really have to understand all of these things behind it. I mean, in some ways, it's like you're caught in a time warp with the current culture.
Right. I think, actually, it's not so much about simplicity. What I think is more harmful of what's happening right now is that we live in an age where people are self-curating their content.
Yes.
That's
for the first time in a way that they never could before.
The access and what they have, so they're doing this sort of confirmation bias. They're looking for things that are going to confirm what they want to think is what's going on. When, if you have the discipline of the research and the study and sort of the expansiveness, you begin to realize that the nuance is inescapable. And so that's probably the biggest enemy that we have is, somebody will come in, well, I've been researching for 20 years about my grandmother's people that were from, and in the back of my head, in the back of my head, I was like, that's very nice. And the words that come out of my mouth, of course, are far more diplomatic than what happens when I have my bourbon.
Look at that, it's another bourbon drinker.
Right. So, and so I manage this, and I try to listen in, because that's probably the most important tool of all. But it makes me crazy. It makes me absolutely crazy that somebody thinks they can spend time on Wikipedia or Netflix and think that they, or whatever, and think that they have an absolute understanding of something that, colleagues have spent decades studying. Decades. And so there's so much out there. In terms of American history, these 4 years of the American Civil War is the most written about and the most studied in our nation's past. And yet, it is the part that is least known because people cling to these heritage narratives and this general lie that Americans told each other so that white America could reconcile. And so now to break that up, to be kind of in the middle of breaking that up is really fun. It's really a lovely thing.
And it's also raw for people. I mean, you talk about this 4 years, more than 150 years ago. For some people, the stories that they've been told about it and they continue to tell themselves are what make them whole in their minds, right? They inoculate them from the awfulness of that period. And again, that's another hurdle I would think you're facing there.
Well, I mean, and so all jokes aside and flippancy, the reality is this was a massive trauma on American soul. And we need to bear that in mind. We have America's sin, or one of America's sins, with the enslavement and the subjugation of black bodies that's at the heart of this conflict. But we also have a period of profound trauma. So if you think of it as a trauma, then you have to go through stages of grief. And if you think about it that way, you begin to understand how these narratives are formed for the varying parties to deal with this level of loss. Listen, excuse me, historians have reworked the numbers. I mean, really been able to dig in the numbers. We used to say it was 620,000 casualties in the American Civil War. The reality is it was 750,000, and that doesn't include the civilian population. Now, the equivalent of that is imagine us dealing with the tragedy of 9/11 every 12 hours, every day, every month, every year for 4 years. That's what the American Civil War was to that generation. So needless to say, with that level of loss and trauma that everyone is experiencing, people grappled with and created ways to deal with it as you would dealing with trauma and stages of grief. And so where we are 150 some years later is that some of us are still in the denial. Some of us are still, we're not in the shock anymore. Some of us are in the bargaining. And this is where we start hearing foolishness like there were black Confederate soldiers, which makes me nuts. Black people, stop it. There were not black Confederate soldiers. There were impressed and compressed slaves who were used by the Confederate Army. And yes, there were good old slaves who stood by their masters when they fell and picked up a gun. But that did not make them a soldier under the Confederate laws and rules. They did not want that because war had always been affiliated with manhood. If you allow a black man to fight in the war, what are you saying? He is equal and right. So the Confederacy was not about that. And when the Union Army finally came around to do that with the Emancipation Proclamation, and what was discovered in the midst of that was extraordinary and led to a period that was extraordinary. So again, so we have this bargaining period, and a lot of people are still in the bargaining. And then there are people that are just mad. That last stage of anger. And I would say that the anger is what we're seeing now in terms of the public landscape. Whether you're angry and you are sick and tired of seeing Confederate monuments on the landscape and you want them down, or you want to change the names of the schools or whatever, or you're on the other side of that saying, well, if you tear them down, it's just like ISIS and you're being like this and you're being like, I mean, I've heard it all. And my thing is, well, it's a statue. It was put up by communities for a particular reason and a purpose. And communities evolve and communities take them down all the time. In American history, we've taken them down all the time. And it doesn't mean we've lost our history. We've lost our propaganda. And there's a difference. And so that's, and very few, I think, have reached that final stage when you're dealing with trauma, and that is acceptance. Of this is what really happened, and so what do we do to move on? So, again, 150 years later, after that level of trauma, a trauma that, quite frankly, is generational. We have it in our DNA and our bones. So if you want to know why we have the kinds of issues that we do, it's because the level of trauma whether it was enslavement or whether it was war and death and destruction at that scale, has really been imprinted on us. It's really been imprinted.
But of course, black people should just get over it.
Oh, of course. Get over it. Right?
Move on, right?
Move on. Get over it.
So I wonder if you can talk about quickly some of the artifacts that you have in this museum, which are remarkable, first of all, for just the fact that they still exist and are on display and people can interact with them. But I wonder if you can talk about the power of those artifacts when people see them.
Sure. So for those of you that don't know, the American Civil War Museum is actually the merger of two museums. We did this in 2013. I had gone to Richmond to work at the American Civil War Center at Historic Tredegar, and in 2013 helped orchestrate a merger with the Museum of the Confederacy. And to be clear, it was a museum about the Confederacy, not for it. But the collection, because that museum actually did start as a museum for the Confederacy, had extraordinary pieces that had been given directly by prominent and iconic families. So 16 of the 17 Confederate generals all gave their uniforms and personal accoutrement. All of the papers that survived the fires when Richmond burned, et cetera, were a part of this collection. All of the propaganda period of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, Sons of Confederate Veterans, all of that became a part of the archives. So here was this collection, though, that because the lens, and of course the American Civil War Center, since we from our founding was all three of these things, we have this incredibly rich collection of USCT material as well as Union material. And so all of this came together. But what we discovered is about half of the materials in the MOC collection actually had a Union or a black story to tell, right? So for example, we have 350 battle flags in our collection, and all Confederate battle flags are not what you see and identify as Confederate flags. And about 100, 150 of them had actually come into the collection in 1905 from the United States government because the government didn't know what to do with captured flags, which meant United States forces had captured these flags from the Confederates. As we did more work when we became the American Civil War Museum, as we did more work on this, we discovered that many of them had been captured by United States colored troops. So now we had a direct connection to black troops and now black men and their families in particular, and stories that we could tell. So those are some of the examples of materials that we have. We have an extraordinary photographic collection, well over 6,000 pieces of photographs of black men, women, and children, Asian Americans that are in Chinese to be specific, that were also fighting in this war. We have images of Native Americans. How many of you knew that the Cherokee Nation actually aligned with the Confederacy because they were a slave trader? Did you know that? Okay. We also have material about the Dakotas. We have information about the Creek Indians who actually served with the United States forces. So we're able to tell this extraordinary story of a war of the continent. This wasn't just North and South or black and white. It was a huge national conflict that was based on whether or not we were ever going to really live up to the ideals of the nation. Right? So this was the unfinished business. This was dealing with the compromises that the founders made to just get the nation started. They knew that this regional conflict was going to come to a head. They just hoped that it wouldn't come to war. And so our collections reflect these stories and so much more. And our goal with all of this is not just to teach people that about the Civil War, but the reality of how much this war really impacts our lives today. Quite frankly, the money in your pocket is a reflection of the American Civil War. We didn't have a United States government currency, the greenback. The United States government, for the first time in the American Civil War, decides to go off the gold standard to finance the war. and they establish a par value for it. And they start paying people. And it was so successful because state banks, well, they were kind of crooked, right? But they decide that this money, when the war is over, the United States is like, okay, give us your money back. And Americans, north, south, west, everywhere, said, no, this is actually kind of cool. And that's why we have a currency that says for all debts, public and private. This was a direct Civil War thing. Our triage and medical practices, because we had never seen that scale of death before, so we established military hospitals and we established a system of triage and care. As a matter of fact, the company that started making prosthetics for all the limbs and so forth during the Civil War, he was a carriage maker. Well, that company today produces half of the world's supply of prosthetics. And that's just sort of the little stuff. I won't even get into the political stuff and the ramifications of that. But it created most harmful for us, I think, and I talk a lot, I'm sorry.
Okay. That's why you're here.
What's harmful for us is that, the biggest lie of the Civil War is that it was states' rights. And the biggest lie of the Civil War is that black people weren't a part of their own agency and freedom, that somehow freedom was given. And so we also correct all of those. So our new museum, we merged in 2013. We became the new museum now. Our goal is to be the preeminent center for the exploration of this war and its legacies. We have done that. And one of our next stages is that we're opening a new facility that opens in May. So come on and visit me in the summer after May. Because it's profound, and I have been blessed to work at some pretty remarkable institutions. The Charles Wright certainly was a training ground, beyond training ground, in terms of the things that I learned here and the extraordinary community and people that I met that are still very much a part of my life. A few of them actually in this audience today, to help put me where I am. So that's where I think the Creator has an extraordinary sense of humor, that I'm in this space now.
Yeah. Okay, Christy Coleman, thanks so much for being here. Okay, so they asked me to get out here at the end and give some closing thoughts. And if you guys know me, you know that's one of the sort of difficult things that I do sometimes. But tonight it's even harder. And the reason is pretty simple. So our theme tonight was reunion, and we had a lot of sort of throughput on that throughout the night, right? Different guests and themes and things. But for me, the reunion is this. It's you guys. I have been sitting here looking out all night at people, some people I've known my entire life, some people I met tonight, some people I've known through work, people I've known through my personal life, and I've watched the way you've received all of this up here and all of the performances and all of the conversations. And my heart is just full. This is just overwhelming for me to be part of this, to be the host of a show that can bring people together in reunion this way. So I want to thank you guys, not just for coming, but for helping me feel the way I do right now and as the host of this show. So give yourselves a hand. And I promise that in 50 years, we'll do all this again, right?
At Masco and at our business units across the globe, we strive to create an inclusive and diverse culture that allows our people and the communities where we live and work to thrive. We join with American Black Journal to further this important work and enable different voices, perspectives, and experiences to be fully heard.
Support also provided by